Hello and welcome to the Young Texas Summer Reform podcast. I'm your host Taylor DeSoto. And in this episode we are going to be addressing the question, is King James onlyism a cult? See, recently on Facebook, the podcast Cultish posted about King James Version onlyism and asked if there would be an interest in covering the topic on their show about the cults, the occult. Just some background. I met with Jerry, who runs the show, last year, and I recommended that, and at the time it came up, he said it was on his radar, and, I told him, I was like, that one of your pastors there at Apologia considers me a King James onlyist, which means that you'd be calling me a cultist, and especially considering that, they have friends in Moscow, Idaho, who also fall into the King James Version only camp, according to James White. So by running that episode, they would be calling a lot of people that they do ministry with, even, either related to being in a cult or in a cult. And so at the time, I think they decided not to do it, but it came up again. So it looks like we might be seeing a series about it. So I thought I'd record a video addressing the claim, or answering the question, is King James onlyism a cult? We've seen even in the comment section on this channel that people have compared it to a cult, that, Steven Anderson, one of its biggest advocates, is the Charles Manson of King James Version onlyism. So this is not like an obscure question. This is something that, through rhetoric and polemics, I think has become a pretty common thing that people think about when they think of King James Version onlyism. So in order to do this analysis, I'm going to be tapping into Walter Martin, some various other sources, to evaluate if it indeed is appropriate to even call King James Version onlyism in any of its forms, any of its articulations, a cult. So let's first start by looking at Walter Martin, and then I'm going to kind of interact with Walter Martin a little bit and maybe, push back on some of his definitions and see if we can get to a reasonable definition of a cult. And then we'll go from there. So some of the reasons some of the characteristics that Walter Martin gives, he writes the Kingdom of the Cults, one of the, what some people consider to be an authoritative work on the topic, at least in the, the Apologia crowd and all that. So he says, first and foremost, the belief systems of cults are characterized by closed-mindedness. They are not interested in a rational cognitive evaluation of the facts. The organizational structure interprets the facts to the cultist, generally invoking the Bible and/or consistency. They exist in what we might describe as separate apartments in the cultist mind and are incapable of penetration or disruption if the individual cultist is completely committed to the authority pattern of his organization. So this framework, when applied to an organizational framework, to an actual cult, makes a lot of sense. But one of the things I'd like to push back on this is that when applied kind of uniformly across all systems, I think that it falls a little bit short. For example, Apologia Church, which heavily emphasizes eschatology, postmillennialism, could be called closed-minded. Jeff Durbin, for example, has said on a number of occasions that the gospel is not really the gospel without, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, the reconstructionist kind of post-millennial perspective. And, that would be considered very closed-minded to anybody that does not subscribe to Rushdoony type of reconstructionalist post-millennial theonomy. And Apologia being so closely associated with James White, James White, as we know, repeatedly appeals to consistency and, that they're completely committed to this, what you could call authority pattern of the church. So Christianity itself, I argue, is extraordinarily closed-minded, especially as it makes the claim that it is the only way to salvation. So closed-mindedness is not a good descriptor for a cult. Dogmatism is not a good descriptor. Like, you can't say, oh, well, that person's dogmatic, that person's closed-minded, therefore we're bordering on cult-like behavior. That wouldn't be fair. I think in Walter Martin's quote here, what's important to latch on to, it has to do with the authority pattern of the organization, that the organizational structure is the lens they view things through. Not the scriptures, not theology, but the actual structure itself, the cult itself, becomes the interpretive lens for the theology. Now, we can say that appealing to consistency is not necessarily something that is cultic. It has to do with the interpretive lens of the cult itself. If you're a Christian out there, you know that dogma is a part of the Christian religion. You know that these are the kinds of things that make a religion unique, is their dogma. So another component set forth by Martin is isolationism, which in my opinion is far more an indication of a cult than, perhaps dogmatism. The kind of dogmatism that is cultic is the dogmatism that is done through a cultic organization, right? You can only read the Bible through this interpretive lens as the cult deems necessary, as the cult deems appropriate. Now, isolationism, I think, is one of the biggest red flags for identifying a cult. In my experience with cults, which I have a decent amount of contact and experience with, a cult will isolate its members from their family, from their friends, and even from other members within the cult through shunning and shaming and other means. And so Martin rightly points out, quote, "We do not wish to imply that there is no such thing as an authoritative dogmatism that is valid and true, such as the teachings of Jesus Christ." And that's really important to recognize. Like, we can't say that because this is dogmatic, it is cultic. That would not be accurate to say, especially considering that Christianity is quite dogmatic. So we have to be careful when using definitions and defining cults. And there's a lot of overlap between cult and proper God-glorifying religion. That's what makes cults so dangerous, is that they borrow from the truth, distort it, and use it to manipulate people. That is how people get wrapped up in them, because they borrow from the truth. They get a lot of it right. It's just where they're wrong, it's very wrong, and it's very dangerous. And usually the reason that the truth is being twisted is for the purpose of manipulation, control, personal gain of either the organization or the actual leader of the organization. It's not usually for the benefit of the people in the cult, typically. And so that is why another more important distinction of a cult is some sort of figurehead or piece of literature that provides an extra-biblical interpretive lens to the Bible. This type of material or person is usually, but not always, received by way of divine revelation or claims of divine revelation. An angel came down, a prophecy came to me, I saw this in a dream, God spoke to me directly. These are the kinds of things that are very, very common and typical in cults that usually will change the typical interpretation of the scriptures. Oftentimes will result in extra biblical pamphlets and books being written that supersede the authority of the scriptures altogether. So we see this with Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon, Mary Baker Eddy with Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, and most obviously in cults where the leader actually claims to be some sort of second coming of Jesus, or Michael the Archangel, or some sort of prophet sent by God. In any case, these cults have an external authority outside of Scripture that actually provides external revelation or additional interpretive principles that must be used to read Scripture and understand Scripture. So Martin points out that cults have a form of doublespeak as a result of this, where words are employed differently within the context of the cult than are generally understood by Christian people and even non-Christian people. The typical use and understanding of words are changed and distorted so that a different message can be preached underneath what appears to be perfectly orthodox language. Mormonism does this again exceedingly well. They have different definitions of what the gospel is, who Jesus is different in Mormonism, what salvation is, the way to salvation. You have all these terms sort of co-opted. They mean something entirely different, such that it's a totally different religion, a totally different God, a totally different expression of even the English language. So another common trait is that the leaders of cults will often make failed prophetic statements. This is the test of the false prophet. Joseph Smith did this on a number of occasions. The Watchtower organization, for example, under Judge Rutherford, said that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would return to Earth before the end of the 1920s. Failed prophecy is a really big because what these cult leaders do is they get this big following. They claim to be, a prophet or Jesus himself or an angel or some incarnation from God. And they make these wild claims. And while they're alive, they get a lot of money and other sort of personal gain, women, things like this. And then they die, and then the prophecy doesn't come to truth, but they're already dead. So they got what they wanted out of the cult. So you can look back on that and say, well, look at all these failed prophecies. Why are you still following this cult leader, essentially, who was right about not a lot? Anything new that he added to the conversation, he was wrong about. So that's another distinctive of a cult. So there are a number of things that can be observed about cults, but we have to be discerning and try to pick out exactly what it is that makes a cult a cult. Not just things that cult leaders do or cults typically do, but what actually fundamentally, substantially makes a cult a cult. We can't just look, like for example, at a car and a motorcycle and say, well, they both have engines, they both have wheels, and they both have turning mechanisms, and say that's the same thing. Just because they have some of the same characteristics doesn't mean that they're the same thing. So we have to be really careful and nuanced here when we're setting up this framework for this conversation. For example, I've seen people call all of independent fundamentalist Baptist churches cults, which I think is wildly irresponsible. And so when we call things that are not a cult, it cheapens the meaning of what a cult actually is and makes it extraordinarily difficult to actually discern the dangers of what a real cult is, to identify what a real cult is, and to know, hey, I need to be getting my brother, my friend, my cousin out of this thing. If we can't adequately define what a cult is and what makes them so dangerous, then we won't have the discernment to actually practically apply our knowledge of cults to any real life situation. So that being said, it would seem more valuable to comment on what is absolutely unique about cults rather than discuss the overlaps that it has with proper true religion. Otherwise, Christians will just call every system they disagree with a cult. And that would be unfortunate. It is actually pretty common. I've seen it even on my YouTube channel. Like I said, people calling the IFB a cult, like all of the IFB, just a cult, not saved. It's pretty scary. So I suspect because people who study cults haven't been, or at least provide an apology against cults, haven't necessarily been careful enough to focus on what makes cults dangerous. Instead, they sort of focus on aspects of cults which are not necessarily unique to cults themselves. And so, someone will see something and they'll have read a book and they're like, oh, well, this was something that, this cult did, so I should avoid, all of these churches that are maybe solid, that have church membership, for example. Like someone could say, well, cults have strict membership. Well, so do most Orthodox Christian churches. So you have to be careful when providing distinctions like that. And as a side note, it's actually pretty common, especially among the secular class, to classify all religions as cults. And that kind of further cheapens the term and really it makes it meaningless. And, there's a lot of examples of this where you use words in the wrong way, either hyperbolically or just incorrectly. And it cheapens the gravity of the word, or it cheapens the meaning of the word to the point where it's not as frightening as you should view it as, or it's not as powerful as it should be. So, which means that like many topics, like most topics actually, the vocabulary, the terms that we use, they're defined differently depending on who you ask. And so, as a result, discussing this topic accurately is pretty difficult. Everyone seems to have a different definition of a cult. Everyone seems to have a different definition of all these terms. So in this lengthy introduction, I'm going to try to define some terms and establish, the perspective I'm going to be assuming throughout this presentation, so that I'm as clear as possible while discussing what I view to be a pretty serious topic. So let's work through this together. Let's work through our definition of what a cult is, And we're going to start by using the process of elimination to determine what a cult is not. And I'm going to be coming from a Christian perspective, obviously. Like I said, if you're just an atheist and you're like, well, Christianity is a cult, like, well, there's nothing we can do for you. Like, we're operating out of two totally different frameworks here. It's not going to work. But for my Christian audience, I think you can find this most agreeable when as I've defined it. So I have to establish, I don't think that the Orthodox historical Christian faith is a cult. That's going to be my initial starting point. So that is to say, then, categorically, that religion in general is not necessarily a cult. There is a proper way to practice religion, which is most beneficial to the man's soul and most glorifying to God, which I proposed it's Christianity. That is the proper. So you could even say that, and this is where we have to be careful, that all religions outside of Christianity are a cult, but again, we would be operating out of a definition of a cult that is exceedingly broad and probably not that helpful. So we'll make the distinction between proper religion and improper religion. And within improper religion, you have heresy, you have apostasy, you have heathenism, you also have cultic types of improper religion. So there's sort of different kinds of improper religion, cult being one of them. So basically, there is a proper way to practice religion, which is most beneficial to man's soul, most glorifying to God, which we, as Christians, argue is set forth in the Holy Scriptures. So if we believe that God exists, it must be true that there is a proper way to live and believe according to how God desires his creation to live and believe. That makes sense. That's, if there is to be a God, that would be the case. So excluded from our definition of cult is proper religion, true religion, as defined by God in the Scriptures. All right, fair? Are we all tracking so far? So this should be expanded a little further, though. There are religious practices which are not defined by God. In the Reformed camp, we call them, regulative principle, things that are not in the regulative principle, things that are not set forth in the Scriptures that we practice as a part of our religion, which are not inherently cultic, right? There are things that people do incorrectly that are not cult behaviors that we can attribute to either ignorance or perhaps misinterpretation of the Scriptures, right? People can be in error in certain things. And the things that people can be in error in, we typically say are secondary and tertiary doctrinal issues, such as church government and liturgical practice. So this is to say that there are fundamentals and non-fundamentals in proper religion. These are agnostic to what we might call cultic distinctions. A Credo Baptist wouldn't call a Paedo Baptist a cult member on the grounds of the mode and timing and reason for baptism, right? We would just say the Baptist would call the Paedo Baptist in error, and the Paedo Baptist would call the Credo Baptist in error. We don't go around and throw this term cult around, right? So I think we're all together here on that. So we see that defining a cult must be done carefully with a lot of precision and not done haphazardly on the grounds of a secondary or tertiary doctrinal disagreement, right? So that being said, so a lot of you might get off the boat here, right? So I'm answering the question, is King James Version onlyism a cult? If you're in the camp that thinks that King James Version onlyism is a secondary or tertiary doctrinal issue, you can stop watching the video now. The question is answered for you already, right? Cool. So I might lose a lot of viewership here because you're like, oh, okay, obviously not. But if you're of the opinion that it is actually a primary issue, let's continue. So far then, what doesn't distinguish a cult is just generic religion or secondary doctrinal disagreements within true or proper religion. So that is to say that there is religion that is not categorically a cult, unless we descend into some sort of absurd position where we call all religious practice a cult, which fundamentally makes it impossible to say that a cult is necessarily a bad thing. Unless you're willing to say that, like all types of belief in God or a higher power or religion is just cultic and bad and destructive, which historically is just simply untrue. It's naive, it's arrogant and ignorant. So I know that probably none of my audience is atheists, but I just had to put that out there. So before we go on to what is a cult, I want to discuss a slight disagreement that I have with Martin here that I think my audience would understand and agree with. I think we'll all find agreement here. Dogmatism and closed-mindedness are not necessarily distinctives of a cult. Cults have distinctives that are dogmatic and closed-minded, but so does every other system. Every religion has dogma, which necessarily means that every religion has something that can be considered closed-minded. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me, in John 14:6. That is exceedingly closed-minded, arguably the most closed-minded religious statement ever made. And since Christianity is categorically closed-minded and dogmatic, then those two things cannot be distinguishing factors of what a cult is. Right? So if there is dogmatic and closed-minded elements of true religion, of true scriptural orthodoxy, then we can't say that those are distinctives of a cult, right? So if we're going down the street and someone says, like, I'm dogmatic about salvation through Christ alone, that's what I believe, and someone says, well, that's very closed-minded of you. You must be in a cult, right? Do you get what I'm saying here? So dogmatism and closed-mindedness are simply characteristics of religion in general. So most Western religions are so-called closed-minded when it comes to what is considered moral behavior. Thou shalt not murder is a very closed-minded statement to somebody that does not see an issue with murder. So again, we return to a point that I made earlier. There is a proper religion, a true religion, proper dogma, proper closed-mindedness, right? We don't think that child sacrifice is an issue of open interpretation as to what, if it's morally right or wrong, right? We say we are closed-minded and dogmatic that child sacrifice is an abomination. I think a lot of secular people would even agree with that, right? So, speaking of secular people, there's a lot of secular people that are closed-minded and dogmatic without even being they're religiously dogmatic about certain things, like the climate. They're about waste, about child labor in factories in India and China. Dogmatism is something that everybody does and is not unique to cults. So I think we've nailed that point home. So generally speaking, most people have at least one or two things that they're very close-minded about and very dogmatic about, right? So ironically, secular systems seem to actually be very dogmatic about a lot more things than Christians are, it seems. So it's not a question of whether dogmatism or closed-mindedness is cultic. It's about the substance of the dogma. What is actually there defined by the dogma? Proper dogma and proper religion is not cultic, but improper dogma, improper closed-mindedness could be. Right? So we have distinctions there that we need to recognize and nuance and be able to acknowledge, or else we can't proceed in this conversation. Right? If we just sit here and say that all dogma is cultic, we can't meet in the middle. There's no conversation to be had. So now that we've set a framework down, let's talk through what I think my audience will find most agreeable as to defining a cult. And I'll use Martin again as sort of a framework here. So many cults share a lot of things, such as a charismatic leader. Perhaps that leader has received some sort of vision or prophetic revelation or personal interpretation of a religious text that was given to him by an angel. This is almost always indicative that this is a cult. But I argue that that's not necessarily the main distinction. And we'll touch on that in a second. So there's really one thing, I think one really important thing, one distinct thing that a cult does that makes it a cult. And that is how the cult is structured. That is how the cult operates. If we remember in Martin's initial definition of what a cult is, the problem was not being dogmatic. It was being dogmatic through the lens of a cultic organization. That was the problem. And that's kind of what I'm going to expand on here. A cult will almost always practice isolation by way of shunning, shaming, blackmailing, and intimidation. If you step out of line, you might be followed, you might be fined, you might be ostracized, people might not talk to you. You could potentially have someone call into your job, say something false about you, and lose your job. Cults do these kinds of things. So basically you have to believe and do exactly as the organization requires, as the cult requires, or you will lose your salvation. You will lose access to the cult and the members within it. You will lose access to God, they say. These are all things that cults do. They practice shunning, isolation, shaming. They use religion as a manipulative tool to control people, typically to get people to practice unhealthy behaviors, such as, excommunicating yourself from people that are not in the cult, spending your life savings on some sort of religious program that promises enlightenment or salvation. They make them do things like quit their job or change their job because it gets in the way of their cult obligations. And, oftentimes we see this a lot, that they need to enter into sexual relationships with somebody in the cult, probably the cult leader or perhaps a lieutenant in the cult, things like this, even if they're married to someone else. So they make people engage in what is naturally unhealthy behaviors. Leave your family. Even if you're healthy, you have a healthy relationship with your family. Now, one thing we need to talk about here is that there are good reasons to excommunicate people from your life. Let's say you're recovering from drug abuse and, you had a crack addiction and you get saved. You come to saving faith in Jesus Christ and you set yourself apart from those friends that were constantly putting drugs in your hands. That's not cultic excommunication. That's doing what is godly and healthy and scriptural, right? So there's a difference between cultic excommunication where, let's just say you're best friends with your mom and the cult makes you cut off all contact with her. That's not healthy excommunication. Healthy excommunication would be if every time you went to go see your mom, she beat the crap out of you and gave you drugs, and that was your kind of relationship with her. That's not healthy. There's proper reasons to excommunicate so-called someone from your life. In a religious cult, it doesn't matter what your relationship is with these other people. Typically, they will cause you, if this person is asking the wrong questions about the cult, investigating too much, won't join the cult, then there's going to be some problems for a cult-type organization. So cults encourage people to practice unhealthy behaviors. Cults also encourage members to increasingly make their whole life about the operations of the cult itself, and not necessarily the religion, but the cult itself. So a cult is not necessarily so much distinguished by doctrine, but by the organizational structure of the cult itself. So that is not to say that a doctrine cannot define a cult. It's just more difficult to define a cult by doctrine. So there's a little bit of an overlap here where we see in particularly dangerous cults with dogma and control. And that is when a cult is defined by one person or a group of people at the top of the cult. They usually will claim that they're the second coming of Christ or something similar. They're prophets, they're ordained of God, they're something special that has never come along before in the history of the world. That's typically the kinds of people that run cults. They say these things, at least. They don't necessarily believe them. Sometimes they do. But to listen to this person in a cult is to listen to God himself. And we can easily say that that person is saying that to have control over a group of people, but the reason people follow that person is usually due to the doctrinal belief. Well, if this person says they're the second coming of Jesus, I should pay attention to what they have to say. I should go marry his brother. I should be his concubine. I should give up my life savings to keep the cult going, to support the cult leader's lifestyle. They don't necessarily do this because of the cult leader in every case. Sometimes they do. But in a lot of cases, it's because of the religious dogma attached that's being used as a manipulation tool. You won't be saved if you disobey this command, because I am sent from God, kind of thing. So that's the overlap, right? Doctrine is often used as the mechanism of control. Even if what makes the cult is actually the organizational structure, there's a lot of tools and means that they use to control different people. They appeal to their religious and emotional sentiments to do what they want them to do. So that doesn't necessarily mean the doctrine is cultic. It means the way the doctrine is being used is cultic. So a cult, I argue, and this is probably where, a lot of people might disagree with me here because, we'll see, but a cult is not necessarily so much distinguished by a particular doctrine, but the cult itself. So that is not to say that a doctrine can't define a cult, especially in the case where someone says they're the second coming of Christ. That would be a very specific type of cult, but I'm trying to make the category distinction here, where what makes a cult is the way that the structure is organized, right? And the way they manipulate people and the actual act of manipulating people and controlling people and all that kind of stuff. It's dangerous. And usually the doctrinal distinction is spiritually dangerous too. And that's why as Christians, we really do care about this stuff. We care about the claim that is made when something is a cult, because it's spiritually devastating to people. It's putting people on a burning boat to hell. Very dangerous spiritually, but also very dangerous physically for their well-being and their safety and their mental health and everything like that. So this brings me back to one of my initial points. All things can eventually be categorized as a cult if we're not very careful with how we define cult. There are questions that are difficult to answer, such as, is a cult always dangerous? Now, this is kind of a side note, but I want you guys to come with me on this. Think about this for a second. Cults, without fail, are always dangerous spiritually. Always, always, always. And most of the time, they are dangerous to the health, physically and mentally, of the members too. But that's an important thing. Like, technically, a cult could be all about living healthy, making a lot of money, benefiting the community, living in healthy marriages. Like, there could be a cult that's like all about doing everything really, really, really well and perfect. I don't think it exists, really. Mormonism might be the closest thing to it, but this would be exceedingly rare. But I want you guys to get this category in your mind that we have to nuance this thing down to the bottom so that we can understand what a cult is. And I'm arguing that it's the organizational structure. So the point of me bringing that up, doctrinally, a cult could be all about improving yourself, could all be about living your best life now, could be about living the most extraordinary, wealthiest life ever, but could be a cult in that if you're not striving to do those things, there's shaming, there's shunning, there's all that stuff that could lead people to be killed, lead people to be excommunicated, and all this sorts of things that are still very cultic. So even though that's kind of like a hypothetical of a hypothetical, we just keep this in mind. So now that we've nuanced this definition a lot, let me make a few generalizations that I think are more relevant and common. So if we zoom back out, let's talk about kind of generalizations that we can all kind of agree on and I think are most agreeable. I have a hard time, thinking of anyone that would object to anything I'm about to say here in terms of defining a cult. So 1, a cult practices isolation, shaming, shunning at an organizational level. A cult uses some unique doctrine to get the cult to engage in the shaming and shunning, threatening a member's spiritual and sometimes physical safety if they do not comply, threatening their work, their livelihood, their family, this kind of thing. And so this is usually implemented through a charismatic teacher or leader or prophet or prophecy or interpretive principle, or a group of prophets or a group of people implementing a book that someone wrote long time ago and they're dead now. So a cult, this is 3, a cult departs from orthodoxy in some place which changes the religion altogether, making it not Christian. Taken to its logical end, this usually means salvation can only be found through the cult itself or the practices of the cult, or perhaps even through the cult leader or leaders. 4, dogma and closed-mindedness are not distinct to cults, so I exclude it from my definition of a cult. Though cults may be dogmatic and closed-minded, what matters is the substance of what they're dogmatic of and what they're closed-minded about. So with all of that out of the way, let's talk about King James Version onlyism. Is it a cult? In the first place, there is not one definition of King James Version onlyism. In probably, I think, the most definitive work, at least most people would it's in textbooks, it's in universities, seminaries. This book, is considered kind of to be the standard when it comes to King James Version onlyism. You have a couple of other works, but this is sort of the work on it. And James White in this book defines 5 different categories of King James Version onlyists. So when we say, is King James Version only a cult? According to James White, there are 5 types of King James Version onlyists that could be cultists. And these range from I like the KJV the best to the KJV as new inspiration, new revelation. So this is my first problem even with the question. If we frame the topic as is KJV-onlyism a cult, we by necessity need to specify what type of King James Version onlyism we're talking about. Are we talking about grandma who likes to read the King James, who grew up on it and just doesn't want to buy a new Bible? Or are we talking about the person that thinks that if you're reading a Bible not in the English King James, like a Russian person not reading the English King James, the entirety of Russia can't be saved because they're not reading the King James? Are we talking about that? Or are we talking about something in the middle? Or we have to be very careful here, especially when we're throwing around the word cult, right? So we by necessity need to specify which type of King James Version onlyism we're talking about. And this is one of the major issues I have with using the term King James Version onlyism in general. I often find that nobody is actually talking about the same thing. Everyone's defining it differently, but we have sort of this blanket term, and you could be having a conversation. I've done this a million times, where I'm having a conversation about the same exact thing, I think, with somebody because we're using the same term, King James Version onlyism, and about 20 minutes into the conversation, I realize we are using totally different definitions, and this is really no thanks to James White, who has made the definition so exceedingly broad that majority text people are King James Version onlyists, and KJV readers are KJVO, grandma who reads a KJV, like, this happens all the time now. So that's why I have an issue with even using the term King James Version onlyism if we're trying to have a debate where we're not talking past each other. So I often find that no one's actually talking about the same definition, so the question itself is flawed by virtue of the fact that the definition of King James Version onlyism is so broadly defined, even by the people who write very officially and academically on the topic. So secondly, even if we were to take the most extreme example of KJV onlyism offered by James White, we still run into issues defining it as a cult. This most extreme group, we're just going to take the most extraordinarily extreme, version of King James onlyism. We're going to take James White's version and go even further, right? Actually about the same, just his 5th group. So this group, according to White, believes that the KJV was re-inspired and is more authoritative than the original Hebrew and Greek. The KJV is the only Bible, period. Okay, so that's our extreme end of the spectrum as defined by James White. But even that can't be properly defined as a cult. There's no control structure. There's no charismatic leader. There's no center of operations. There's no organization or people group to be shunned from or people to be isolated because the doctrine itself isn't organizational. It's not a cult. So even if somebody believes that you can only be saved by reading or hearing the KJV, that salvation is that salvation that they're talking about is not attached to a control structure. It's not attached to a group of people. It's not attached to a cult. And that's the problem with calling King James Version onlyism a cult. You can believe in King James Version onlyism in the most extreme form and not go to church, not have any friends, not have anyone to manipulate, not be manipulated by anyone, which very problematic if we're trying to be honest here. So this can't be properly defined as a cult. There's no one to be shunned from or no one to shun. So even if somebody believes that you can only be saved by reading it, most extreme version, there isn't a church like Scientology called the Church of the King James, where the King James Version onlyists all come together and they, practice cult-like behavior. This doesn't exist. The closest thing that I could find was a church called King James Bible Baptist Church, which is a Baptist church. That is King James Version only. The control structure, and this is a really important point to those that still are not convinced. The control structure is the Baptist church polity, is the pastor, is the group of elders if they have multiple, not the King James Version doctrine. So very quickly we find that it is impossible to define King James Version onlyism as a cult, because King James Version onlyism has no control structure. It is not an organization. There are no organizations that practice the shunning and blah, blah, blah that I'm aware of. Any organization that does this does so within the framework of a church, of usually a Christian church. So the control structure is the church. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. So if we're going to make the case that King James Version onlyism is a cult, we'd have to do so on doctrinal grounds alone. It's some sort of doctrinal cult. So in the final segment of this podcast, I want to address that point. The idea of calling something a doctrinal cult. It's calling something that has no cult leader, no building, no headquarters, nothing that makes it a cult. We would have to make the case that it is a doctrinal cult, not a physical one, which I'm guessing those that call King James Version onlyism a cult would probably say, okay, I'm with you. I want to call King James Version onlyism a cult, and you're giving me a way to do it. Okay, well, let's go. In order to examine this, let's assume that this is true, that it's a doctrinal cult, and let's set our definition of King James Version onlyism as those who believe the KJV was re-inspired, and it is the only way of salvation for people, right? We're going to take the most extreme version of King James Version onlyism, and we're going to assume that it's a doctrinal cult. So what this cult believes is that salvation cannot be obtained for the ESV or the NIV or anything else, or through a church or preacher or evangelist that does not use the KJV. This person can exist, and this is really kind of where we're talking about categories and consistency here. Pay attention. This person who believes all that stuff can exist outside of a church. This person can live in a cave by themselves. This person can exist outside of a group, outside of a control structure. This person can read an article online, watch a video online, be convinced, and go on and live their life, and no one may even know that they're this, so-called cultist. They might not know anybody in real life that believes the same thing as them in our hypothetical situation. And this very well could happen. I've actually met someone that was like that. He actually goes to a very big popular church that's very evangelical, was the most extreme version of King James Version onlyist for a season, right? So this brings up an interesting observation. If the most extreme version of King James Version onlyism, which we're calling hypothetically a doctrinal cult, it can exist outside of a control group, outside of a group of people. So since that's the case, we're talking about something far less insidious than a cult. I think we would just call that a doctrinal error. See, it's a significant one, but even I wouldn't say that person's salvation is at risk. So as long as their doctrines, their fundamental doctrines of salvation and of God are correct. I wouldn't say just because they have an error about what the King James Bible is, that they're necessarily not saved, right? Maybe some people would disagree with me there, but like if someone said the same thing about the ESV, I would say I think you're in error, but I think you could still you're still saved because you have the right salvation doctrine. So this brings me to a much more relevant question on our topic. Can the King James Version onlyism be used as the doctrinal distinctive of a cult? I think we kind of dispelled the idea that King James Version onlyism could be a cult itself, right? Because someone could be a so-called cultist without a cult. If you're a cultist without a cult, you're probably not a cultist, right? From like a category perspective. So if we can acknowledge that premise, then we can move on to what I think is probably the much more powerful argument. If we're assuming again that the most extreme version of KJV-onlyism is a cult. So could King James Version onlyism be used as a cult's doctrinal distinction that they use within the context of their organizational structure to manipulate people? So in our definition of cult, which I think I find most agreeable and my audience will find most agreeable. We state that a cult uses a doctrinal distinctive to manipulate the emotions and behavior of the members of that cult. Usually, this takes form in end-time prophecies, or a cult leader claiming to be God or Jesus or Michael the Archangel, or that salvation can only be had through that cult, right? It's typically what goes on. So, what if an organization uses the King James Version only doctrine in its most extreme form as the doctrinal distinctive that they use to manage members of the cult, to engage in cult-like shunning, shaming, intimidation, that sort of thing? In theory, I guess it's possible, though it would be a rather unremarkable and unconvincing cult, in my opinion. The church can teach, for example, that every member is to use the KJV to be saved, and if they don't, they could be shamed and shunned like a typical cult. Are you tracking? But the actual behavior that would make it a cult would be the shaming and shunning, not the KJV only doctrine itself. The King James Version doctrine, though in this example very extreme, isn't the actual cult-like behavior here. It is a means to the cult-like end of whoever is running the cult. See, if a member of such a church wanted to leave and go join another church that used the KJV, for example, that maybe claimed to even be a KJV church, but maybe there was a degree less, extreme, what would make that church, the actual cult-like behavior would be whether or not the church let them leave on good grounds, right? So if a member wanted to leave, and the church said, you can't leave, you will lose your salvation, it's not the King James Version only doctrine that they're now appealing to. It is the church of the cult that they're now appealing to. The doctrine of a cult. There is salvation only in this cult. That's the cultic behavior. That's the cultic doctrine that is underneath the KJV doctrine in this hypothetical example. So how the church responds to a member leaving is often a really good indication that they are or aren't a cult. See, if a member of a church wanted to leave and go to join another KJV church, how would they respond? Would they follow that member? Would they shun that member? Would they blackmail that member? Would they harass that member? Would they make that church... What would make that church a cult would be if they said, you not only have to be KJVO, but you also have to be KJVO here. That's what makes it a cult. And at that point, the real dangerous doctrinal error, the cultish doctrinal error, is exposed. The KJVO doctrine, while wrong in this example, is not the cult's chief doctrine. The chief doctrine is that the member must be a member of that particular organizational structure of that cult to be saved. The KJVO, so-called in our example, is just a means to an end, and I'm using that as an example of the most extreme form of what we could be possibly talking about here. And if the church just lets the member leave without threatening the salvation status of the member, I don't think anybody, including myself, would call that church a cult. You just say they have some wonky doctrine that they probably need to correct. They're in error, not a cult. If a member were to leave, it would be a matter of leaving over a doctrinal difference, not leaving a cult. And so we have to be very careful, again, what we're calling a cult. The actual problem is when a church says that salvation can only be had through itself or through the cult leader or through the organization, and the cult will use unique doctrinal distinctions to accomplish that manipulation and control. That's what makes it a cult. That is why I have made the careful distinction between a cult and the doctrines that a church uses to manipulate its people. In a lot of cases, the doctrine itself is erroneous enough to be easy to tell, such as someone claiming to be a prophet or the second claimant coming of Christ, so on and so forth. That's easy to tell. But what happens if it appears to be a very, from a doctrinal statement on their doctrinal page, very orthodox, but you show up and you realize you have to be not only believing all this doctrine, but you have to believe all this doctrine at our particular congregation and through our particular pastor, our cult leader, right? Usually cults are easy to spot because it's a psychopath or a narcissist or someone leading the thing, and it is pretty apparent, pretty obvious. So, I mean, if you wanted to run a cult, that's kind of the claim you have to make, right? You have to say that you're the second coming. You have to say that you're a prophet. You have to say that you're somehow important, sent by God for people to kind of follow you. Even the most extreme King James Version onlyists would reject that prophet because they still, despite their reasoning being flawed for why they read the King James, believe in what's in it. So we really need to be careful here, guys, if we're calling King James Version onlyism the most extreme form of cult. Call it wrong, call it erroneous, call it heresy, lowercase h if you want. So let's pull this all together. In conclusion, I've been going for a long time. It's a longer episode. I hope you're tracking with me. I hope you've kept up with all the little silly nuances I've been making. But I think they're important, and I think they help us build out this discussion in a meaningful way that's not just ideological and dogmatic, right? We started out this episode by nuancing the differences between cult structure and cult doctrine. And even then, there's a further distinction of erroneous doctrine being used within a cult structure, right? That's not necessarily cult doctrine, like someone being the second coming of Jesus Christ. I made the observation that cults use doctrine to manipulate, but that it's very difficult to actually define a doctrine as cultic unless that doctrine is directly related to a specific cult congregation. Like where someone claims to be the second coming of Jesus, then you could say, okay, that's very clearly a doctrinal cult that's practicing the cult within the confines of that doctrine, right? But what makes the cult is the way they practice and implement shunning, shaming, isolation, manipulation. We discussed that the definition of King James Version onlyism is extraordinarily broad and thus irresponsible to use as a blanket statement regarding cult doctrine in a discussion over whether or not it's a cult. We ended by using the most extreme version of KJV-onlyism as supplied by James White and tried to plug it into a situation where it could be considered a cult. And we discovered that the doctrine itself was very difficult to call cultish. My conclusion is this. In the first place, it is alarmingly irresponsible for a Christian to just call KJV-onlyism a cult, especially considering that the pinnacle work on the topic includes people who simply like the KJV the best as a category of King James Version onlyism. Secondly, it is categorically impossible to take even the most extreme form of KJV onlyism and call it a cult if our definition of cult is anything close to both a dictionary and colloquial definition of the term. Thirdly, extreme King James Version onlyism could be used, technically, hypothetically, as a doctrinal bludgeon to run a cult, though I argue it's a rather weak distinctive and the actual cult itself would be the organization using the doctrinal distinction. The King James Version doctrine wouldn't be the cult itself. I think we've done a great amount of analysis here, so I'll cut it. We'll kind of finish up right now. Anybody who is concerned about categories and consistency, like the people who argue against the King James Version only people, should deeply consider the points made in this video before just blanketly calling King James Version onlyism a cult. If someone were to just say, KJV onlyism is a cult, that could mean that your grandma who likes the KJV the best is now a cultist, according to that person, which I think we can all agree is slanderous and a violation of the 9th commandment. If they don't define what they are talking about when they say KJV onlyism, this is unavoidable. And I argue because of the sloppy scholarship in this book. And if someone does define the most extreme version of KJV onlyism as the cultic problem, they then have to actually use a meaningful definition of cult to explain how it is a cult. How does it exert power over people? Where are the control structures? Who's doing the shunning and the shaming and the manipulation? And as we discussed earlier, the organizations may use this extreme version of KJV onlyism, but the KJV onlyism cannot categorically be called a cult. So in this job, I think we did a thorough, or in this podcast, I think we did a thorough job explaining the difficulty of calling KJV onlyism a cult, even in its most extreme form. And in the end, my analysis is this. KJV onlyism is not a cult in any of its forms, though in its most extreme form, I agree that it's very dangerous doctrinally, very wrong doctrinally, but not a cult. And I think it's irresponsible to say as much. In its worst form, it's a doctrinal error, but it is not a cult. Now I'll end on this. I don't consider myself a King James Version onlyist. I consider myself, call me a received text advocate that reads the KJV. I think the KJV is a perfectly accurate translation of the right texts. I think that it is immediately inspired, as it's inspired in the Word of God because it translates the immediately inspired and preserved text accurately into English. I think it should be used as the English-speaking Bible. But I don't call myself a KJV onlyist. And, I fall into one of these categories in this book. So, if Cultish were to do an episode on this, I guess I'm a cultist now. And my family is a cultist. My church is a cultist. Joel Beakey is a cultist, apparently. Grandma, who reads the KJV like she has her whole life, is a cultist, apparently. And man, that would be a shame. I think that would be a huge shame and a disservice to people trying to develop their discernment and figure out what's dangerous. And I think this has a really big opportunity to damage a lot of people's relationships with their friends that read the KJV. I think it has a lot of potential to divide people in the church. Because if we start calling KJV-onlyism a cult and that just becomes mainstream, that's what it's going to do. Even in its most extreme form, it's hard to argue that it's a cult. But you know what? The extreme form is few and far between. I personally have never met anyone that believes the fifth category found in this book. Never met anyone. So, with that, this has been the Young Texas and Reformed podcast with your host, Taylor DeSoto. May the Lord bless you and keep you. I hope this has been helpful for everybody. I hope that I was easy enough to follow. And we will see you all in the next episode